Welcome to Summon Adventurer, a father and son podcast where we talk intergenerational gaming, specifically role-playing games, and more specifically, Dungeons and Dragons. Everything from world building, home brewing, map making, conlanging, preparation, narration, simulation, improvisation, and maintaining a long campaign over the span of many years. I'm Fong Nguyen. I've been a writer for 22 years and a gamer for 37 years.
And I'm Henry Nguyen. I've been playing D&D for 8 years and role-playing since way before then.
So in our last session, we talked about homebrewing new D&D worlds and rules, which both you and I do. And in this session, we're talking about preparation and improvisation. And of course, when we talk about homebrewing, we're talking about a completely different level of preparation from working from a module. But in both cases, the DM needs to know how to improvise and think on their feet. So my question to you is, why is improvisation always important in D&D?
I mean, I think by nature there is no situation in which you can play D&D without improvising. It's part of what separates it from just like a video game, is that in D&D you are playing with factors that are out of your control, those being the players. So you have to be able to take what they give you and use it in the world. So to at least some degree, you have to be able to improvise based on what your players give you. And if you don't, then you're not actually playing D&D. You are just talking at each other.
It's a surprisingly absolute answer, right? Because theoretically, one could have like a script that considers every single variable, but then is that still D&D is the question, or are you just sort of doing a very good algorithm? And I think as artificial intelligence becomes more and more of a presence in the gaming space, that question will become more salient. You know, at what point are you playing a role-playing game, and at what point are you playing a video game?
Since D&D has been around, there have been video games which are meant to simulate what it's like to play D&D. There have been games that offer you a bunch of choices and text-based role-playing games back in the day, and now more recently there have been a bunch of open-world RPGs that try to capture the feeling of D&D. But I think at its basis, D&D is a storytelling game and an improv game among multiple people, and so it can't be done only through a computer, at least at this stage of technology. And at later stages, I don't know if it would still count. It's very easy, I think, for improv to lead to these great, silly moments in campaigns. So have you ever improvised more solemn moments that have turned out very well in your games?
Interesting. As you say, improvisation is part and parcel with the game, and so it's hard to think of a situation in which they're not improvised to some degree. What I have done is I've prepared things, not like a dialogue, because you can't prepare a whole dialogue with responses that are fit to exactly what your player is going to say, because you don't know what they're going to say. But I've prepared certain moments that if the opportunity arises, a character will say something meaningful. And there are times where I've been surprised that those meaningful moments have arisen without any advance preparation. And I can think of a moment where a player improvised a speech in response to something that had happened. He had been a mentor to a young aspiring adventurer, and that young aspiring adventurer was killed indirectly by their nemesis. And he gave a speech in which he was giving the declaration of intent to kill this enemy, and was appealing to any of his party members to intercede or to stop him from doing so, and none of them did, and so he sort of committed to revenge. So that was kind of a solemn moment that I didn't improvise, but was improvised in the moment in response to something that happened in the game. How about you?
Almost every one of my favorite moments in D&D have been moments that I've not prepared for, whether solemn or funny. Because part of the reason, I think, is because I am not surprised by the moments that I prepare for. Those moments that I have come up with, I really enjoy when they happen, and I enjoy seeing my players react to them. But I think my favorite moments that I've experienced as a DM are the moments that either my players improvise something or I improvise something that's completely unexpected, and it surprises everyone at the table.
Right. So what kinds of things do you prepare and what kinds of things do you improvise? Like, for example, you obviously can't improvise a map, but you can't prepare a dialogue, as we mentioned, because characters are going to give unpredictable responses. So what kind of things do you improvise and what do you prepare?
I think the number one important thing to prepare as a DM is the course that you want the story to go in. I think that if you know what's happening in the story, you know where it has to end up, or when certain things are going to occur in the world. If you understand what's going on in the greater scheme of everything, then the amount of actual session prep you have to do is very little, because you can take what you know about how the story has to go and what's going on in the world and incorporate those into the session. So if you know, for example, that you need to introduce a certain NPC so that this character can lead the players somewhere they need to go, then you don't need to have a full session planned. You just need to think about where is this NPC going to be and how are the players going to meet them. And you don't even have to write anything. You can improvise those parts of it.
Now, I'm surprised by that answer because I've considered myself a story-based DM, and yet there are still situations frequently that arise that take me away from the story I'm trying to lead them toward into an unexpected story territory, right? So when you say, you know the story that you want to tell and how to get there and what times to reveal certain things, it seems like so often the best laid plans of mice and men, right? So as also a story-based DM, how do you deal with those kind of pivots?
Firstly, when I say like knowing which way the story needs to go, it's on a very macro scale. For the caveats that the getting sidetracked that the players do in a session, I think if anything, that is easier to improvise than the bigger story beats. Because if the players decide to go to some random town or follow around some random NPC, then you can just create stuff about the world and about that NPC on the spot without it having a huge effect on the story that you want to tell, because it is by nature less consequential. But if you can incorporate the things that the players want to do into the greater story, that is even better. If you know that you need to introduce this NPC to bring the players to a certain location, and they have their own agenda, they want to talk to some random silly NPC that you've accidentally given a funny name to, and suddenly they're enamored with, then you could try to give that NPC connections that will lead them in a similar direction as the other one that you were thinking of introducing, if you need to keep things on track. I think a lot of people talk about this sort of illusion of choice that the DM presents, where it's like, you can go left or you can go right, but they both lead to the same town. I don't like doing that because it makes the world feel very small. And if the players end up going again down that path and taking the opposite way, then you have to be prepared at some point. I like to understand the tropes that I'm trying to present in a world. If I'm trying to run a campaign where there is some sort of evil empire that has taken over, then I will allow them to go to a town and show all the people being miserable and, complaining about the power of this empire. Or if the empire is very good at propaganda, then I'll have them go to this town and all the people are praising the emperor who's, saved the town from poverty. Because if you can understand those tropes and the things that you want to convey, then you can draw on those very easily to improvise these places or situations which you've not planned for at all in either the adventure or the session.
Right. I'd say at times I've been guilty of orchestrating certain moments because I really look forward to them and want them to happen within the game. And sometimes they feel forced and sometimes they do work. But when it comes to the overarching story, that's actually an area in which the player's involvement is maybe even more salient in my games, because the reason that the long campaign ended in the way that it did with this apocalyptic moment was because they kept on avoiding this main quest and doing side quests, right? They kept being distracted. There was like a real ticking time bomb, so to speak, on this apocalyptic threat. They knew that they had this formidable enemy who was working on a plan. They didn't know what the plan was, but they didn't investigate that plan and instead were caught up in all the minutia of, administrating this governmental council and pursuing all of these things that arose in the process of governance. And that was literally put there to distract them by their enemies, but they fell for it and kept falling for it. I did place some signs in their path to lead them in the other direction, but they were very distractible, and that's why things led to an end to that particular campaign. I say end in quotes because it's possible for them to return to this campaign without getting too far into the weeds. So what are some of the absolute essentials for preparation? Like what can't you do without?
I think that you can do without most things. If you have practiced a lot as a DM, then you can go into a session with very little prep and still be fine. I think, though, that if you want the session to progress the plot, if you want stuff to actually happen during the session, you should probably prepare, at the very least, certain things that the enemies are doing that the players need to react to, or give quests to the players that they need to do in order to progress things. If you don't have a plan for a session, it's very possible to run a very fun session. It's just that more often than not, in my experience at least, it will end up being a silly shopping session or a funny side quest where players help out these less important NPCs. Or it'll be some sort of fetch quest because those are easier to come up with than things that tie into the main plot. So if you want to have a session that will progress your campaign plot-wise and not keep it stagnant, I think that you need to prepare an outline of what sort of things either the enemies are doing or the situation that the players have found themselves in, or what sort of quests that you need to give them, something to drive it forward. So
you can do without stat blocks because you can just look those up online in an instant if you need them. You can do without maps because especially you and I do like theater of the mind often, and we don't rely over much on things like maps. One thing I cannot do without is a list of names, because if they just ask like a random guard at a tower, like, what is your name? If I don't have a list of names beforehand that are appropriate to that, region, like character, situation, whatever, then it's going to be like John Potato. It's like, it's going to not be good, and it's going to seem ridiculous. And so what I do is I have lists of names that are for different races, classes, genders, regions, and I use those while playing. I refer to them while playing because my players often ask somebody's name. So there's an encounter that I don't expect will lead to a conversation. I think it's going to be a combat, and then it leads to like a dialogue, and then I have to come up with a name real quick on the spot. So that's one thing that's an absolute essential for me. Another thing that is an absolute essential is interesting items and loot and things, because that's another thing on the spot. If like after every encounter there's just like X amount of gold, X amount of silver, X amount of copper or something like that, it's possible in that moment that I'll be too flustered at wanting to have something unique and creative that I'll give them something too powerful, and if I'm improvising that, or that I'll just leave it at a bunch of treasure without anything unique and interesting about it.
With that, I think that it's important, if you're going to be giving your players like magic items, I think it's very important to prepare those. And if you're going to have your players fight a custom homebrew monster, it's very important to prepare that, because those things are completely conjured from your imagination. So if you don't have any prep for that, it's going to be very hard to balance those by improvising them. I think once again this leads into this idea of if you have a session where they're not going to fight a monster, or you don't plan on them fighting a monster, then you don't need to prep a stat block for the monster. Or if you have a session where you don't plan on them getting a magic item, you don't need to prep a magic item. And if they happen to stumble upon a magic item during that session that you haven't prepared for, then by whatever means, then I think you're justified as a DM in saying, like, I have no idea what this does yet because I've not prepared it. If you're trying to play your cards close to your chest, it might be harder because you will have to come up with something in this spot. But fortunately, there are like magic items in 5th edition, at least. There's the Dungeon Master's Guide has a lot of magic items that you can take from, that you could potentially find one and give to the players. And in terms of names, this is where knowing Elvish comes in handy. Because if they ask the name of some elf, at least, you can be like, I am Einandil, the friend of the gods.
We have a Quenya expert on our hands here.
For other people, it's harder.
That, I imagine, would be handy, especially in elves, but, you know, you're going to have to learn Dwarvish, and you have to learn all the other languages if you want. That actually brings up my next question, which is, how deep does the history and lore need to go? Like, do you need to be prepared if a PC asks for an impromptu history lesson on the relations between halflings and gnomes in a particular region? Or, like, this goes into world building as prep, right? Like, how much of that do you need to have at hand in the moment when you're improvising?
All of it. No. You do not need to know the lore of gnomes and halflings. It's important to know the type of world that you're running, like high fantasy, low fantasy. And it's important to know what sort of feeling that you want to evoke from it. And so you don't need to prepare entire lectures. But if someone, if you have like this wizard school, for example, and someone is like, I want to attend a class on conjuration, you don't have to come up with the full understanding of how conjuration magic works, but you could put in some references there in like if the magic system is very much mirroring what D&D does, then you can say like, we draw upon the power of the weave, or we conjure these beings from specific planes for the conjuration class. And so that will make the world feel full, because there will be stuff that they're hearing about, and at the same time, you won't have to prepare an entire lecture on how conjuration magic works.
You sing my song there with the conjuration lesson. I would love to role play a conjuration lesson at a magic school, and a very pretentious professor who's bloviating about how all magic is conjuration magic. And when you do invocation, you're conjuring something for a moment. When you do illusion, you're conjuring the illusion, and you know. Right.
Obviously, fireball is a conjuration spell. You create a fireball.
Right. Where does the fire come from? It comes from the elemental plane of fire.
plane of fire, obviously. Necromancy is just conjuring souls into
there you go.
Bodies.
Yeah, see. But when it comes to knowing like the deep lore of the game, I agree that you don't need to know all of it, because there's, you know, it's a world's worth of knowledge to know, and even the people that the players are interacting with are not going to know all of it. But some of that can be fun to improvise, even at the risk of somebody getting it wrong, right?
It is extremely fun and extremely risky, for lack of a better word, to improvise lore, because I do this all the time. There will be points in which I'm running a session and the players ask about some facet of lore that I have not prepared. And so I will make something up because this is something that I probably should have prepared but haven't for whatever reason. So I will make something up, and then I will have to find a way to later on when I'm prepping for a session, I'll have to find a way to make it actually work in the cosmology or in the rest of the lore that I have created. Or I'll have to justify why the person who told it to them was slightly wrong about this piece of lore so that it manages to fit. But it's very fun to do because every time you add lore to your world, it makes it feel more complex and bigger, and like there's more stuff going on than just what the players see. And I think that's what you want to do as a dungeon master, is make it feel like you are an entire world when you're just one person. And so having to fit lore into other lore that you've just created spontaneously is a very fun exercise, but it also sometimes leads to situations where you're like, I said that was the god of the sky. I already made a god of the sky earlier and I forgot about that one. So I guess there must be two gods of the sky. So what are the implications then? And that can lead to more stuff.
Yeah, that's sort of to paraphrase Neil Gaiman. He said, make it up as you go and then make it feel intentional, right? So it's a good just storytelling shorthand. Like if you are making things up on the spot and then later on you have to justify them, if you can make that feel effortless to the players and make it feel seamless, then there's no difference between having constructed that cosmology in advance or that world detail in advance and having improvised it, right?
We've talked a little bit about what I do for session prep, but what does it sort of look like for you? Like, are you sitting down at a coffee shop typing it up? And what does like an actual document for your sessions preparation look like?
In my case, I do work at a coffee shop and I'm usually supposed to be writing, and I take a little time away when I feel the inclination or get a D&D idea and want to pivot for like half hour, an hour or something like that. And so I will open up my Google Docs and I have core documents and then prep documents. And my core documents include a summary, a calendar, the world maps, the information about the populations of different lands, the homebrewed rules. And that's not the extent of it. There's lots of core documents. And so sometimes the ideas that I have will go into those core documents, the cosmology, everything like that. Sometimes they will go into my prep documents. They're more sort of short-term considerations. And I have prep documents for every session. Sometimes I will, if we don't get a lot done in a given session, then I will cut and paste and then do like a, where we left off kind of paragraph so that I can summarize for them, because we play a bit like once a month, so they need a little bit of reminders of exactly where they're situated each time we play. And some players reread the summary documents in advance, some of them don't, and that's fine. But in any case, we go through those sessions beginning to end, and if we don't reach the end, then I just sort of paste that into the next session's documents. But what the documents themselves look like, I generally don't have to create my own stat blocks. I'll just provide links to those stat blocks in those documents so it doesn't take up a lot of space. I will include sort of general information. I will include some description that I can draw upon. Some of the description is improvised, but some of the description is written down in advance. And it doesn't look like a module, though. I'll say that. It looks much more like a narrative than a module. But I also create decision trees. And I wanted to ask you about this, too, because I get the impression that's not like a normal way to prep, but it's how I like to prep. So I have branching paths based on what narrative direction you anticipate the PCs will take. Sometimes they take directions that are not on those decision trees, and then it's pure improv, right? But I do like to include that as a part of my preparation.
My prep is also surprisingly like prosaic. I will write a little recap usually, and then my session prep usually consists of what I expect to happen during the session. And sometimes I will have little caveats saying, if this doesn't happen, do this thing. But it's not really a decision tree as much as if-then statements as little tidbits. And about like 80 or 90% of the time, it does not go as I have written out in my session prep notes. But because they're there, I can think about what happens, what would have happened if they had taken that path, and what will happen now that they have not taken that path based on what I've already written out. And so it is probably not the most efficient way of doing it, but it's the way I've been doing it since I've been a DM, so for like 8 years, and it's a habit that I've gotten into where I'll write out what I think is going to happen in the session, and then they deviate from it, and I have to reason out what happens now.
One of the more interesting aspects of my prep, I think, is the way that I build characters. So what I see in modules often is like a couple descriptive words or phrases or like ideals, flaws, and bonds and those kinds of things. And I find that the temptation is to be really reductive. The temptation is when you play that character that you're going to keep on talking about their one flaw or their one bond or ideal and forget that they're a whole person, right? And so one of the things that I do is I have some hypotheticals that I put the character through, these kind of hypotheticals to help me kind of understand them. And if they're an important enough NPC, I'm not going to do this for every little NPC that comes along the way, but if they're an important NPC, I really want to understand them better than just a list of descriptive words. Sometimes I'll do like a spider chart, it does list qualities, but then from those qualities it gives examples so that you can think about, let's say, if the character is alcoholic, right? There's a lot of different ways that one can be alcoholic. It's not always uniform, and it's not always the same. And so you can talk about whether they're struggling with it, whether they embrace it, whether it's something that they go in and out of, or whether it's overwhelming kind of, the high functioning or low functioning. Are they somebody that is able to hide it well? So yeah, the quality is not enough. I need to give examples, and I need to have a fuller sense of them by putting them through a bunch of hypothetical situations.
A lot of what I do is think about what role that they have to play for the players, whether they're adversarial or helpful, whether they're a quest giver or just some parallel character that doesn't interact much with the players. And then I will try to make sure that they can fulfill that role even when I flesh out their personality. So a character can be adversarial to the players without disagreeing with everything that the players say, for example. And so I do my best to make it so that they have at least one point of contention with the players that's important. And then I can flesh out everything else so to be more complicated than that, so that at the very least they can continue to serve this role while being a full character. And a lot of the fleshing out of NPCs that I do is either during or after the session that they appear. I will often introduce a character and not really know much about them, and then when they interact with the players, those are the hypotheticals that I have to put them through in the session, which is probably riskier than planning it out beforehand. But I see how they react to the players, and then after the session, I will type up a little synopsis about what they think about each of the players, or sometimes I'll forget to do that and I'll just remember it. But when I'm like dedicated, I will type out a little synopsis about what they think about each of the players, and that will flesh them out more.
One thing that has happened just as a consequence of having shapeshifters in my game is that the players are very wary of NPCs in general. They don't know who is really who they say they are, right? If you introduce shapeshifters as a regular thing in the campaign, then that creates a kind of distrust of anybody who's not player controlled.
Yeah. I actually want to ask you a question, which is not related to the topic of this podcast, but I don't know if it'll come up in another episode.
Okay, sure, go for it.
When you have shapeshifters that turn into party members, right? How do you run that? Do you like act as a party member and all the rest of the players know that it's a shapeshifter, but their characters have to not know? Or do you like try and finagle it so that the player acts as the shapeshifter?
So you mean the PC is not just a party member, right? Because the NPC party members can. Okay, so that hasn't come up yet.
Okay,
but I suspect what I would do is contact that player in advance, let them know that that's, or like by text or something like that while we're playing, because we play online, and let them know that that is a possibility, and that I'll role play for them, or they will leave the session and I'll play as them or something like that. That actually, I'm mistaken. I've been playing for so long I forget the things that I've already done. This has happened, but in a very different context and a very long time ago. And I just played as that player, and the players knew that it was an imposter, but they had to role play without player knowledge that the NPC was actually one of the PCs. But I think I would handle it a little bit differently, and I would probably do a little advanced preparation with the player and maybe prime them and say, like, this is how the character is going to act, because it's actually somebody else in disguise. But is there such a thing as too much preparation? Have you ever found yourself in a spot where you think you might have over-prepared?
There's no detriment to over preparation as long as you're willing to abandon what you have prepared, because you can prepare a lot for a session, and then when something doesn't go the way you think and all the prep that you've done is now it's not relevant anymore, then you have to be willing to abandon it and not try and drive your players back to it, because that will lead to a sort of railroad feeling session. That said, there is a detriment to it in that you've spent a lot of time preparing, and now all that time has been wasted. But if you have the time to over-prepare, then you can do so. I think in general, over-preparation is a lot better for preparing the world and preparing NPCs, because those can be brought back later, even if your players don't meet them that session. But preparing exact session notes, I think it's very easy to prepare far too much, and then your players will go down a different route. Or they might just not finish what you have prepared because you have so many minute details that they will go through it at a slower rate than usual, and that will cause the session will cause them to end earlier than you expected in what you have prepped. And so it's not a bad thing, but it shows that you have prepared maybe slightly too much.
One of the hazards of over preparation, at least when you're playing online, is that you can rely too much on the text. You can, read things aloud, and like when you're playing around a table, it's the improvisational nature of it is much more organic. But when you can prepare, a villain's speech or something like that, and you can still seem to be looking into the camera, looking into the characters or the player's eyes as you deliver the speech, and you can sort of channel the feeling of it, that can be effective. But if you rely too much on that, it, as you say, can feel kind of railroaded. And if you get too used to that, then when you're playing in person, you can be a little awkward because you're less accustomed to the kinds of improvisational moves that you need to channel in order to have a successful session.
In my experience, I role play a lot better when I don't have something written down in front of me. I think if I have something written down, it can feel somewhat stale. Whereas if I don't have something written down and I've just thought about it in my head, or maybe I haven't, this is completely improvised, it feels a lot more lively. I think that you can pull it off though if you have something written down that's like a letter or if you have, there are moments where reading something in the intonation that you usually read something can be effective to the players because it shows them that this is a thing that you've prepared and written down, and that can be a revelation for them. So for example, if your players find a letter, then you can read out the contents of the letter, and that, I feel, can have a very evocative tone, even though it is just the voice that you might use when reading something out rather than acting it out.
Right. On the other hand, I mean, we talked about the hazards of preparation, but what about the hazards and pitfalls of improvisation? What can happen if you rely too much on being extemporaneous without laying groundwork?
I think the biggest pitfall is the most obvious one. You might find yourself at a loss for what happens next or what a character would say, and then it feels like the session stagnates. If you don't have any ideas for what should happen next, then it won't feel like anything's going anywhere. I think that less often, but still very important, is, as we discussed before, if you have a magic item that you forgot to prep for your players, but you still want them to get, then you might be in danger of making it too strong or imbalanced, and then improvising balance is extremely difficult.
Speaking of balance, is there an ideal balance of prep to improv, do you think? You give it a percentage?
What I do, I think, is 30% prep, 70% improv. But for most sessions, some sessions which are more important, which I feel require more prep, it's more 50 or even 60% prep. But I think it's usually 30-70.
I think I'm in that 60-40 range, but I think it's by virtue of the online format. I think I used to, when most of our sessions were in person, it probably would be that 30-70, or even, sometimes like that, famous summer of 1994 when we played every single day in the month of July, and I couldn't prep in advance. It was nearly 100% improvisation. But lately I think it's about 60-40 prep to improv. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily ideal, but that's just sort of where I've landed. Maybe in a 50-50 range is kind of perfect. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that it depends heavily on your improv skills. And I don't want to say this in a gatekeeping way, because I think that anyone can be a DM despite how much they prep or how much they improv. But I think that if you can reliably come up with a story on the spot, then you don't need to prep as much in general. So I think it depends. I have had some really, really good sessions that were 100% improv, and I've had some really bad sessions that were 100% improv. And so I think it can be very hit or miss. But I think that there is, in general, doing prep, combining that with improv to some degree. As long as you're not on either of the two ends, as long as you're not 100% one and 0% the other, then you can have a good balance. I like 30% prep, 70% improv, because that's what I've found myself doing. But I think that for each person, you have to understand how much you enjoy prepping for sessions and how much you enjoy improving, and find a balance there.
And it could be that there is a difference in the ideal ratio given the playing online versus playing live and in person.
But speaking of that, have you ever had a really good session that was either mostly or entirely improvised?
Yes, I think some of the most exciting moments in the history of the game have been improvised, but some of them get really wild and get really unpredictable and are maybe not as good in the retelling, right? And sometimes the improvised moments are so perfect for that very moment, but don't necessarily make a good story to tell later, right? One of the things that excites a DM sometimes is when the players experience awe, and they're like, oh, this is like this really awesome, overpowering thing that's happening, good or bad, in the game. And those like either threats or moments of sublime often come from places that are not going to be as effective unless you are in the game, a participant, experiencing it as it's happening. So I'm thinking of several moments where there would be a demon that they had overcome and banished with great difficulty, and then had been sort of in captivity, in stasis for many, many years, even decades, and then it comes back later on, and it seems to represent this massive threat and changes everything they know about the structure of the world, because they had thought that the hierarchy of the demons had sort of left this one sort of behind. But again, it's not as interesting in the retelling, that one. Yeah.
Obviously, these moments were excellent because of the improv, but and really it's the retelling that's the shortcoming. Do you think that for those moments that you were almost entirely improvised, that left your players in awe or that were really good, could they have been improved if you had prepped?
I have to admit, I'm reaching back quite a bit, right? Because we don't play live very much anymore, and so those fully improvised sessions are way back in the recesses of memory, and I'm sure that they could be improved, especially in the narrative nature of them, right? So like in the moment and the feeling of it, that's one thing, but in the overall narrative, like, so when my players who have an incredible memory summarize back to me some of the things that we played in D&D from like the early 90s, it seems silly to me sometimes. It seems really, I was 15 years old when I started to DM, and some of the things that went on in the game seem silly, but for them, it's like some of the most memorable stuff, right? Some of the most epic things. But I'm also interested in those goofy kind of moments as well. So like our discussion of ratio to planning to spontaneity is relevant to all kinds of art making. It's relevant to performance and to teaching and to making a podcast. So do you approach other endeavors with a similar ratio of planning to spontaneity as you do with D&D?
In other aspects of my life, I like to do planning more. I do theater, and in theater, I like to do a lot of improv because that's what's fun there. But for other aspects, I will say, in terms of things like essay writing, I will often do a little bit of prep so I understand, what the essay is going to be about, and then I will start writing and see what happens. And then from there, I can revise it later and edit it. So I think in that way, I take a similar approach of, like 30% prep and then 70% improv. It's just that I later tune it.
In the book Creative Quest, the author Questlove talks about roll with it spontaneity versus planning, and how some people are more planners and some people are more improvisers. And I've heard people say about music in particular that the trick is to prepare so much that you can make it feel spontaneous and feel natural, even though it's heavily planned, heavily practiced, and make it feel like it's occurring. If you're singing something, making it feel like those emotions are occurring to you for the first time in that very moment. So, but as you said before, some of the best stuff, some of the worst stuff comes out of improvisation. So what are some of the examples of like a goofier, like worse improv moments from your campaign? Do you have any?
There are a lot. I think one of the best, worst improv things that I've done recently, best in terms of how funny it was and worst in terms of world building, is one of my players had received this magical artifact and was talking to their sibling who was trying to bring them back home, saying like they weren't powerful enough to survive on their own. And they said, "Where do you think that I got this artifact?" Because it had been a gift from the gods. And their sibling, who has a very low intelligence, and I was just improvising the dialogue, I said for the sibling, Santa Claus, um, which was a great line. It immediately took everyone out of the game, and they were just rolling around laughing at this because it was just incredibly random. They were in a location that's like equatorial and sea based, so there's never like winter there.
Right.
And
Right.
I've never made any hints previously that Christmas was a holiday or that Santa Claus existed. And so I immediately regretted it because I knew that in saying this, I had made it canon and I had to come up with a reason that Santa existed in the world.
Right.
But in the moment, it was very funny.
So you can't just retcon that, huh? You got to roll with it.
Well, I could have, but I didn't want to.
I think I've had lots of accidental anachronisms and intentional anachronisms in the game. But yeah, notably one time somebody referring to the ups and downs of a particular experience as a roller coaster and then having to retcon that immediately.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I suppose it's possible that like gnomes have roller coasters or something, but it just opened up a whole can of worms. So when you homebrew, do you ever make your own modules, or do you always prepare in this narrative style? Do you do anything that could be adapted by other DMs?
When I plan for sessions, usually not. When I plan for individual sessions and for overarching world building, it's only for me. All my prep is only for me, but it's especially like esoteric and would be hard for other people to decipher, I think, and make into an actual runnable game. But when I run one-shots, which I will sometimes do, I like to prep it in such a way that it feels more modular, I guess. Because, I mean, for no particular reason, it's still me running it, but it feels more complete if I type it up in such a way, like, this room contains this thing, and these are the monsters and the treasure that exists here, rather than when the players enter this room, they would see these creatures, right? So it feels more like a module when I plan for one-shots, because it feels more complete.
The only times I've attempted to make modules, they become like fully fledged stories, right? They just like get longer and longer. Like there's too much explanation to give, too much background, and so they grow and grow, and they may as well at that point become like a novel. So
yeah. That another thing about modules is, for 5th edition at least, they'll often list like this is the specific thing that the player needs to roll to accomplish this task, like DC 15 climb check will allow you to climb up this mountain, and those I will always improvise on the spot. I will never plan a difficulty,
really,
a specific number for a difficulty beforehand. I used to, but now when I plan, I just create the obstacles, and I will come up with the DC on the spot. For like stat blocks for like saving throws and things, I will come up with a number beforehand because those are stat blocks. But like if I'm like, there's going to be a mountain here that they're going to have to climb, I won't think of any specific numbers until they come there and actually have to climb it, and then I will choose. Usually it's in the range between like 13 and 16. Is like my default. But I will, depending on like maybe they use a rope and then it's lower. I don't know.
Since I've been playing with 0th level characters for the last year, I have to give them take it a little bit easier on them and give them like a DC of 10 for a lot of things. So otherwise they'll never climb that mountain.
Right. And I think that is one of the accidental pitfalls that you can fall into when improvising is your players will say that they do something and your immediate instinct as a DM is like, let me set a number to this that they have to roll. And sometimes it's so trivial, right? The thing that they're trying to do is so trivial that you shouldn't have set a number to it, because when they fail, suddenly you don't know how to explain this in the narrative. And other times you'll set it too low, and it's supposed to be extremely difficult. You'll say like difficulty 25, but somehow they succeed at it, and you have to now give them a lot more information than you were planning on doing.
So now it has come time to roll for dismissal. On a successful hit, our summoned adventurer must be banished back to the plane of existence from whence they came. And now I roll. It's a nat 20. The dismissal is a critical success. I'm sorry to say we are done for the day. Fare thee well until our next adventure.